The story that we're going to cover today is the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece, sometimes known as Jason and the Argonauts. Sticking with what we did last time, we were covering, the great Greek hero of Heracles. He is going to show up in the story of Jason. They were contemporaries, roughly, because these stories are at the same time, the late Bronze Age, as far as the Greeks were concerned, who wrote these stories down years and years later. Since we've already been dealing with Greek mythology, we don't need to, again, do any kind of background overview for the culture. We'll simply be able to dive in, take a look at the story, and as we go, I want you to think about the story of Jason in its relationship to the heroic narrative pattern that we set out when we did the introduction to hero myths. I want you to think about the story of Jason as to how well it embodies the monomyth structure, how well it incorporates the various elements of the heroic narrative that we've discussed, and at the same time, I want you to think about Jason as a hero and evaluate him according to the criteria that we set out in the beginning, the three main characteristics all heroes have to have. So as we go through the story, hopefully you'll be able to think through that, but let's dig into the actual story, do a little bit of a background, not historically, but as far as the narrative itself is concerned. Jason and the Golden Fleece. The setting, like I said, is the late Bronze Age, the 13th century BC, one generation or so prior to the events of Troy. As a matter of fact, a good number of the heroes that participate in the quest for the Golden Fleece are going to be fathers and relatives of the heroes that fight at Troy. Now, the story itself is probably influenced in some ways not only by the late Bronze Age, which, if you remember back, ended with a collapse around 1150 BC. You have stories of what we call today the Sea Peoples, and the voyages of these different tribes around the eastern Mediterranean. Possibly some of those adventures may have influenced the emerging legends of the Greeks. But also between the 9th and 8th centuries BC, you have the beginning of the Greek exploration, a period that would lead ultimately to the colonization of a good portion of the Mediterranean. So the Greeks and their adventures at sea probably also in this period fed into the developing narratives. This, again, is a sea voyage, very much like the Odyssey. As a matter of fact, this story probably is older than the Odyssey as far as mythology goes. Now, where we find references to the story of Jason, various places. I mean, as most of these stories were recounted over and over again by different writers in the historical period, our first references actually come very, very early with the writings of Homer. In his Odyssey, which again dates to about 750 BC, he mentions the story of Jason as a well-known tale. And that would be appropriate, again, dealing with a story about somebody who's having a sea voyage. The audience for the Odyssey would have been very well familiar with the story of Jason already by that period. Later in the 8th century, we have the poems of Hesiod. Again, he is the one that gave us the Prometheus story that we looked at several episodes back. In his Theogony, he gives a brief overview of the story of Jason as well. Getting down to the 5th century, we have got Pindar in his 4th Pythian Ode, provides a better, fuller picture of the Jason narrative in there. And then in the later 5th century, you have the writing of Euripides, which is going to give us kind of the end of the story for the most part in his wonderful tragedy known as the Medea. And I will probably recount the events in the play Medea at the end of this lecture, so that you could see what kind of transpires with the later years of Jason. It's worth reading. I think that is in the textbook, so even though the story of Jason is not there, the story of Medea, I believe, is. If you'd like to read it, definitely recommend. It's one of Euripides' masterpieces. He's one of the great tragic playwrights of all time, not just of ancient Greece. 3rd century BC, Apollonius of Rhodes decides to compose an epic version of the story of Jason that is known as the Argonautica, kind of modeled on Homer. And this is going to give probably the most complete version of the quest for the Golden Fleece, though it doesn't give the entire story of Jason in the epic. And as far as epics go, it was not considered anywhere near the quality of a work like Homer. Okay, kind of a second-tier epic, but it has survived, and it's worth reading. Okay, By the way, the red figure vase painting that you're looking at is a picture of some of the Argonauts, and you can notice front and center, the most famous of all of these Argonauts, Heracles. And you can tell, of course, by the club, the lion skin draped over his shoulder, and his bow. He's got all the attributes that we discussed last time, so that's the only way that you could recognize who that is. All right, let's get to the backstory, because before we get to the actual adventure of Jason and his crew, we need to set up the story of the fleece. And it's going to begin in the region of Boeotia with a king by the name of Athamas, who was married to a woman by the name of Nephele and divorced her to marry a younger princess by the name of Ino. Now, Ino wanted to make sure that her children would succeed to the throne of Boeotia. And Nephele had children, earlier children with Athamas, who actually were a potential threat to Ino's children. Now, Ino arranged so that the crops would be ruined a particular season. The one story or one version of the story is that the seed was roasted so that when the people went out to plant the crops, the dead seed would not produce any product. And of course, people are worried. They consult the gods to find out, what's the cause of the fact that we're not growing any food. This is a potential, blight that will destroy us all. So the gods are supposed to give an answer to this. But knowing that there wasn't actually any kind of curse, Ino fakes a response from the gods. She basically replaces the answer from the oracle with a false message that says it's due to a curse by the gods, and the gods, to relieve the curse, demand a sacrifice. And the sacrifice has to be the son of Athamas by his first wife, and this would be the boy known as Phrixus. Of course, this is a great plan for getting rid of the potential heir to the throne. Now, in the story, the boy is rescued. Now, the rescue comes with the introduction of a golden ram. Now, in some versions of the story, it's sent by Zeus. Some versions Poseidon. Some versions Nephele, his mother himself, arranges for the winged golden ram to swoop in at the last minute and rescue Phrixus. Along with Phrixus is his little sister Hele, who jumps on the back, and the two of them fly off into the sky. And as they're traveling over the Aegean Sea towards the east, Hele unfortunately falls off the back of the ram into a body of water where she meets her death, and that body of water will forever be known by her name. It's known as the Hellespont. That's the little waterway that links the Aegean Sea ultimately into the Black Sea. Okay, this is in a etiological myth, basically a myth that's trying to explain the name of a particular location. The word Hele, by the way, if you're not familiar, is just the root word for the word Greek. The Greeks referred to themselves as Hellenes. Their land was called Hellas, right? So basically Hele would be essentially just a Greek girl. Okay, it's a very generic term. Not much different than the word Helen, who is famous from the story of Troy, another very generic term. Anyways, when Phrixus arrives in a place known as Iolcus, this is going to be the setting for a portion of our story in a second, he does exactly the right thing. To thank the gods for his rescue, he sacrifices the ram. Now, if you remember last week when we talked about the story of Heracles, we talked about the bull of Crete, one of the tasks that he had to accomplish, and we said that was a bull that was sent by Poseidon to the Cretan king Minos, and he refused to sacrifice the bull, and of course that brought about a curse on his household. Phrixus doesn't make the same mistake. He sacrifices the ram, and then he gives the fleece of the ram to the king of Iolcus, a guy by the name of Aeetes, whose daughter he actually marries, becomes one of his son-in-laws. And that ram skin is set up in a garden in Iolcus on a tree, guarded by a serpent known as Ladon. And if that is not reminiscent, it's very similar to the other task of Heracles that we looked at the other week, was the Garden of the Hesperides, the Apples of Hesperides. Right, so here's another garden in the Far East, guarded by a dragon, housing a golden item, just like the golden apples. Here you have the golden fleece, and some have interpreted the ram skin as not just a sign of authority or kingship. That's the big question, is what does it actually represent? In the story, it tends to represent kingship, authority, and fertility. If you know anything about the way kings are often viewed in very many cultures, the prosperity of the kingdom is often tied to the king, and that included the fertility of the land. You have a lot of stories where the king, when he is unjust, or if the king is weak and sickly, then the land itself will follow suit. Now, if you ever read any Hittite mythology, there is a similar item that shows up in some of the Hittite fertility myths of a fleece of sorts hung on a tree or on a pole that represents abundance and fertility of the land. So here you have another very similar symbol in Greek mythology tied into that same vicinity. The region of Iolcus along the Black Sea would have been a region very close to the ancient Hittite Empire. Okay, and that would have been an empire that collapsed again around the same time that the Mycenaean era did. So was there a connection between the symbol and this one? It's hard to say, but it's also interesting. The red figure vase painting that you're looking at this screen is actually a really weird illustration from the story of Jason. Here you see Jason being spitted out of the dragon's mouth, and you can see in the background the tree where the ram's fleece is hanging and the goddess Athena standing over him. Apparently there were versions of the story where Jason may have been swallowed by the dragon. This is not the story as it has come down to us for the most part in the major accounts. So there were, as often there are, variations within an oral tradition. And you can think of this very much in line with the whole idea of the conquest of death motif, right? A descent and resurrection potentially that Jason was associated with. Okay. Anyways, that's the origin of the fleece. And here it sits in Iolcus in the possession of the king Aeetes. So now we're going to move back to Greece. Northern Greece, a city by the name of Iolcus. Now, Iolcus was ruled by a man known as Aeson. Aeson had a brother by the name of Pelias. And Pelias was ambitious and rose up against his brother Aeson and overthrew him, seizing control of the throne. Doesn't kill his brother, but he basically pushes him into exile. Now, Aeson's wife at the time was either about to give birth or had just given birth to a young baby boy by the name of Jason. Now, Pelias, of course, would be interested in removing any threats to his possession of that throne, particularly a successor to his brother Aeson, who will one day grow up to hopefully, potentially reclaim that throne. So Aeson has the foresight to get rid of the child, hide the child away, and protect him from his evil uncle Pelias. So Jason is given to the famous centaur by the name of Chiron, and I think I did mention him when we talked about Heracles. Chiron is the most famous centaur in Greek mythology and a mentor of champions, a trainer of champions. So Jason is going to be raised by Chiron in exile. He has obviously a destiny to reclaim his father's throne. And the only thing that was given with the child, or to the child, by Aeson is a ruby ring that he is going to be able to one day recognize his son by. Okay, so if he ever comes in contact with an adult young man who is wearing this ring, he'll know that it was his son. Okay, so that again is a tie back to his father, back to the throne of Iolcus, and a sense of a potential future destiny. Okay, now there are prophecies also that are associated with reclaiming the throne. The main prophecy is a warning for Pelias, who is paranoid, or should be paranoid, because there's always a potential that someone much like himself is going to come along and try to seize his throne. Now, partly there's a curse on Pelias due to the fact that he is not a worshiper of Hera. Hera has it out for Pelias. In his neglect for her worship, she would like to champion a hero, become a patron for a hero that will one day get vengeance on Pelias, and that's going to obviously be Jason. Now, the prophecy that Pelias has is that he needs to beware of a particular stranger who one day will come to town, and he'll be able to recognize this guy by the fact that he's wearing a single shoe. There's only one shoe. Now, when Jason is old enough and has been trained by Chiron and has been told who he is and what his destiny is to be, Jason sets out on an adventure to go reclaim the throne of his father Aeson. Leaving Chiron behind, he travels towards Iolcus, and he comes along to a river. And at this river, which is normally in flood stage in all these stories, and it's very difficult to cross, there happens to be this old woman who's just standing on one bank of the river, hoping to get across, and Jason comes along, and she asks the young man if he would be so kind as to carry her across on his back so that she isn't swept away or, drowned or anything bad. And Jason, who at this point in the story is really clearly a very noble young man, very big, very strong, offers to give her a hand across the river. So he's a gentleman, right? He's a heroic figure. He's the guy who's, looking out for innocent old ladies. But as you should know by this point in mythology, that very rarely are innocent old ladies actually innocent old ladies. They're usually somebody much more prominent in disguise, because the old lady disguises the most innocent and least threatening guys one could take. And it turns out that this old woman is none other than Hera herself. Kind of a test for Jason to see what kind of man he is. So far, he's passing with flying colors. And she is going to now use him to get vengeance on King Pelias. The other thing that's important to note about the crossing of the river, besides winning the favor of Hera, is that as he's crossing the river, of course, what should he lose in the river but one of his sandals? So he comes out on the other side with a patron goddess and with only one shoe remaining. And then on he goes to the city of Iolcus, where he shows up in the city square, very prominently sticking out like a sore thumb. I mean, this guy is head and shoulders above everybody else. He's the biggest guy in town. And Greek city-states back in the day were not really, really large places. You have a stranger from elsewhere come into town, people are going to start talking, word gets back to the king, and Pelias has to come out and see who this stranger is. So we have the encounter with Pelias. Jason doesn't beat around the bush, immediately asks for the return of his father's throne, which Pelias, of course, doesn't want to give over to him. But ultimately, through the workings of Hera behind the scene, there is a setup of the impossible task. Pelias basically poses a question to Jason. He says, once he knows that Jason is out to get the throne, he says, what would you do if somebody was going to threaten you and try to remove the throne from you? What kind of, what would you do? And Jason, guided by Hera, basically says, I would send that person on the quest for the Golden Fleece. And Pelias turns around and says, well, that is exactly the quest I'm going to send you on. And here is number one of multiple impossible tasks in the adventures of Jason. Now remember, a possible task doesn't mean that it literally is impossible. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It means that the character is meant to fail. The deal is, I will give you the throne. Okay, a little bit sounding reminiscent of Gosh Task. I think we've done the story of Esfandiar, haven't we? Yes, we have. Okay, I want to make sure we covered that. It was a couple sessions ago, right? Gosh Task always offering Esfandiar the throne if he does this task or that task. Same type of thing here. Pelias says, I'll give you the throne of Iolcus, or actually I'll give the throne to your father, return the throne to your father if you go and retrieve the Golden Fleece. Jason says, I'll take the deal. Now, Pelias just wants him removed. He wants him sent off on this incredibly dangerous voyage. I mean, traveling over the seas in the ancient world was not the safest thing to do, but it also is a long way from Greece, and the chances of him returning with an accomplished task, very slim indeed. And it will, at least if it is possible for him to succeed, then it will at least get rid of him in the short term. So the quest is for the fleece. The quest is to Colchis, and it is going to involve crossing the sea. All right. The region of Colchis is at the far end of the Black Sea, so not only would he have to cross the Aegean into the Hellespont and then cross through the Black Sea, the whole idea of crossing a sea should be reminiscent of a particular type of trip that we've talked about before. But before we get to that, let's talk about his crew. Because to accomplish this task, he's going to need a boat. He's going to need a crew to manage the boat. This crew, they're going to be known as the Argonauts, literally the sailors of the Argo, and that's the name of his ship, which is named after the guy who's hired to build the ship Argos. Okay? Now, this collection of characters is the Avengers of the ancient world. These are the best of the best. These are the top-notch heroes of that generation, and they're going to include a number of characters. I'm going to give you an abbreviated list right now. Pelias, not to be confused with the king who is currently on the throne of Iolcus, Pelias. Pelias is the father of the future hero Achilles. We've looked at him briefly before. We're going to look at him again in the future. But he is kind of the right-hand man in the story of Jason. Okay, so you've got Pelias. You've got Heracles, who is definitely the most famous of all the heroes. He is not going to make the entire trip with the Argonauts, but he will be a figure that most of the Argonauts thought should be in charge of the mission. He declines and says, it's kind of Jason's task. He's going to be the main guy. He's going to get off halfway through the trip and never return to the boat. Admetus, another figure that we talked about last week with relation to Heracles. This is the guy whose wife, remember, died in his place so that he could have immortality, and then Heracles returns from the underworld, bringing his wife Alcestis back to him. He was one of the Argonauts. Calais and Zetes are sons of the North Wind, the god of the winds, and they are interesting figures in that they're both winged. They're kind of like ancient mythological, angelic type figures. Basically just flying heroes, which is very, very useful. So they've got some superpowers of their own. The Dioscuri, which is the title for the twin heroes Castor and Pollux. They're the children from Sparta, the two Spartan heroes, and brothers of Helen and Clytemnestra that we'll later see when we get to the Trojan War. You have Meleager, who is the hero that we talked about again with Heracles last week, whose sister Deianira, Heracles eventually marries. You've got Orpheus, the very famous musician hero. You have Telamon, the father of the great hero Ajax, who goes to Troy. The hero Laertes, who is the father of the even more famous Odysseus, who goes to Troy. And the one great female hero of ancient Greek mythology, Atalanta, the swiftest and fastest huntress in Greek mythology. And that's just a few, right? We're just scratching the surface. This is a crew of like 50 plus heroes. The list varies from place to place, but I think these are some of the big names, some that you may have heard of before, okay? Actually, some that you should have heard of if you are tuned into the last lecture. Anyways, this is the best cast he could have with him. Now, off he goes into the road of trials. All right, he has basically crossed the threshold at this point, and along the way, there are lots of different adventures. Now, I'm not going to go through and recap all of the adventures, but I do want to point out a few important ones. The most important for the theme of the story being his trip to the island where he meets the figure of Phineas. So let's talk about this guy, Phineas. He's an interesting character in that he was formerly a very prosperous king, and he was loved by the gods so much that they decided they would give him a gift, which is the gift of prophecy. Now, he could see the future, and as a king who hosted very many travelers into his kingdom, when he took on a guest, he would provide them, as hosts do, good hosts, with food, shelter, but he would also provide them with an additional benefit of giving them a prophecy, giving them a glimpse of their future. Now, he thinks he's doing a kindness to these guests, just being a good host. The gods don't see it that way. The gods see this as abusing a gift, overstepping certain bounds, because obviously the vision of the future, it's kind of in the realm of the gods, right? This is their business. This is kind of transcending beyond the mortal realm, a little too close to the divine. And because they see this as a particular crime, a crime that is known as Hubris, I'll explain what that is in a second, they decide to punish him. Now, his punishment is to be put on an island where he cannot die. He is blind. And even though he doesn't have any kind of direct physical torture, there is, in a sense, a physical torture in that he is not able to get at this wonderful banquet of food that is provided every day. There's this table where there are all kinds of wonderful foods, with one problem. It's guarded by these Harpies. So as he, again, withers in hunger, not being able to die, every time he tries to approach this table to gather the food together, the Harpies swoop down from the sky. And these Harpies are just foul creatures, usually characterized as winged women. There are different types of depictions you'll see in ancient Greek art. Sometimes they're just birds with women's heads. Sometimes they're a little bit more gruesome than that, but they devour the food before he can get there, and whatever food they don't eat, they foul so disgustingly you can't even breathe around it. It smells so horrible. So he's not able to eat and not able to die. This is like the torture of Prometheus. I mean, it's just day after day after day, hunger growing and gnawing away at him. It's a torture. It's just awful, as you would possibly imagine if you've ever been hungry. Now, what is this idea of hubris? What is hubris exactly? Hubris is, for the Greeks, the idea of moral blindness. Okay? Rather, I should say moral arrogance. Moral blindness might be a step above that. So you have this moral arrogance or pride that the gods usually will punish before it turns into anything worse. The one state above hubris is full moral blindness, which the Greeks would refer to as ate. Okay, so usually the Greek gods will intervene at the stage of hubris to institute a punishment to humble you, right? To remove some of that excess pride. So that's an important concept. We still have the word today, derived from the Greek. Obviously, that's left over in English. You'll often have some people talking about, hubris, usually spelled H-U-B-R-I-S. Of course, the Greeks, the Y is appropriate. You can spell it either way, technically. Now, Phineas is going to serve as kind of a moral warning in the story. And the story of Jason ultimately is a type of morality tale. All right, so what happens after Jason arrives is his men are able to, being hungry, approach the table. The Harpies swoop down, and Calais and Zetes, the two flying heroes, are able to go up into the air and actually combat the Harpies and drive them away so that Jason and his men are able to eat, and they're also able to allow Phineas to eat. And Phineas is so grateful to Jason and his men for driving off the Harpies that what should he do but prophesy and give Jason some of his knowledge, which is kind of like not really learning your lesson in the end, right? This is the reason he's in prison there in the first place, and as soon as he has the first opportunity, he goes ahead and prophesies yet again. But I guess he figures, what more do I have to lose at this point? So he tells Jason several things. He tells Jason kind of how he can get towards where he's going, where the Golden Fleece is located. He tells him that the goddess who is going to be his savior in his upcoming trials is going to be the goddess Aphrodite. You would think it would be Hera, but he says Aphrodite is going to be the key to your success. And he gives him a warning. Now, the warning is ultimately, look at me, see what's become of me. It's due to my hubris. Don't you fall into the same trap as I, right? That's a warning for any great hero. Any hero that has success in their adventures can very easily start to think too highly of themselves. Heracles, we saw last time, didn't really have that problem because he was an incredibly humble character, but not all heroes are Heracles. Okay, so that's the warning. You want to have that in the back of your mind as you now watch the rest of the story unfold. They leave the island of Phineas, they go forward, and one of the most famous challenges is to get past what are known as the Symplegades, which are the clashing rocks. I don't know if you guys have heard of the clashing rocks, but supposedly this was the entranceway through the waterway into the Black Sea, right? This is the narrow waterway between the Aegean and the Black Sea, and supposedly these two big rocks that would clash together and crush ships. It was a long passageway, and if the ship wasn't fast enough to get through there, the rocks would slam together and destroy the ships. So Jason is actually told by, I believe it was Phineas also, how to get through there. And what he would do is release a bird, and the bird would fly through, the rocks would clash, and as soon as they start to separate again, he would have his crew row as fast as they could. And at the very end of the passageway, just as the Argo gets past the rocks slam together, and forever after, stop doing this. Okay, there's the idea that the Symplegades no longer are going to be dangerous. So Jason gets through safely, and you have various other adventures, but ultimately he's going to get to Iolcus. Actually rescues a shipwreck which included King Aeetes' grandson, who's able to then, in gratitude, escort Jason to his grandfather's kingdom. Now, when he arrives at the kingdom of Aeetes, at Iolcus, Jason meets with the king. The king is again gracious and offers hospitality to Jason. And Jason, after the hospitality has been accepted, turns around and requests the golden fleece. Now, this was offensive to Aeetes because the fleece represents for him the authority over the kingdom. This was, in essence, a claim to the kingdom itself, all right, which would definitely be offensive to any king. Again, reminiscent of the idea that we looked at before with the bull that was sent by Poseidon to King Minos. Remember, the bull represented the acknowledgement by the gods that Minos was the legitimate king, and Aeetes apparently looked at this in very much the same way. But he can't do anything about Jason now that he's offered hospitality to him. He can't turn around and murder his guest. So instead, what he does is he gives him his second impossible task. Aeetes says, okay, I'll cut a deal with you. If you can do these series of adventures, I will then give you the golden fleece. What you need to do is you need to yoke these two brazen bulls that breathe fire. Yoke them together and then plow a field, sowing dragon's teeth into the furrow. Once the teeth are sown into the soil, out of the teeth are going to spring a bunch of warriors that are referred to as the Spartoi. Okay, these are the sown ones. After they spring up from the earth, you then have to do battle with the Spartoi, kill all of them, and then complete the task all within the period of a day before the sun goes down. And Aeetes says, by the way, I do this all the time. So apparently it can be done, but it doesn't seem very probable that Jason's going to be able to do this. Just the first task alone, the yoking of the bulls, is deadly. So how is he going to accomplish this task? This is where we introduce Aphrodite. Now, Aphrodite, while this discussion is going on, causes King Aeetes' daughter Medea to fall in love with Jason. And she does this through the use of her son Eros. Eros is the god of love. He is the one the Romans would refer to as Cupid, a name that you're probably more familiar with. Now, Cupid is usually depicted in Roman mythology and definitely today in art as this cherubic little figure, little baby with wings and a bow and arrow. Eros in Greek mythology tended to be a beautiful youth, kind of late teen, heartthrob type of a figure. But the idea of Eros is that he could shoot you with his bow, or actually with one of the arrows. And I don't remember if we've talked about arrows before with any of the previous stories. A lot of times when I cover the story of Demeter and Persephone, I talk about Eros because he has a big role to play in that story. But Eros basically had two types of arrows. He has gold-tipped arrows and lead-tipped arrows. And if you shoot somebody with a gold-tipped arrow, they will fall madly in love with the first person that they see or whoever their Eros is kind of directing them towards. If you shoot somebody with a lead-tipped arrow, they will basically repel love or shun love. You can see how this could be really problematic. He can cause all kinds of trouble and actually does this on occasion, where he'll shoot one person with the gold-tipped arrow and then the other person with the lead-tipped arrow, so that there's one person constantly pursuing a fleeing lover, okay, or at least a fleeing object of love. But in this story, he doesn't do anything like that. He simply makes Medea fall in love with Jason, and this is absolutely out of her control. But the reason this is important is because Medea is a witch. She is skilled in sorcery, she is skilled in potions, she's skilled in magic. And one would get the idea that if Aeetes is capable of doing this task as often as he claims to do it, Medea probably has something to do with that, her magic abilities. Now, what happens is the night before the task is supposed to take place, Medea has a rendezvous with Jason. And in her passion for him, she swears her undying love, and she swears that she will help him accomplish this task, but at the same time really begs for him to protect her. As you can imagine, in the ancient Greek world, you've got the idea of a patriarchal society where women were, for the most part, relegated to the household. They were under the authority of husbands or fathers for the most part. And if she should betray her father, which she is about to do, she will be absolutely abandoned and vulnerable in her society. So it's really something that she needs to make sure Jason promises to protect her. And Jason, in response to her offers to help him in her confession of love, responds by saying, I love you too. I promise I'll take you with me and protect you. Now, you would get the feeling that Jason is not quite as in love with her as she is with him. He obviously hasn't been shot by the arrow, but nonetheless, he makes the promise. And then she goes ahead and she gives him a few spells to protect him. In one instance, she gives him an ointment, an oil that he can wipe along his body or cover his body that is going to give him protection from the flames of the bull, kind of causing him to become invulnerable, at least temporarily. Might not be a permanent invulnerability, so you don't need necessarily the mistletoe kryptonite weak spot that we often have to see, but for at least a short time until it washes off, he's going to be protected. The other thing that she does is a little bit more gruesome. She does a ritual whereby she turns him into a younger, stronger version of himself, kind of a renewal ritual. And what's involved in this is her putting Jason into a deep sleep, cutting his body into pieces, and then putting it into a cauldron, the classic witch's cauldron. In Celtic mythology, there are lots of cauldrons. We're going to be looking at some cauldrons later on this semester, particularly with connection to the Arthurian tradition. But the cauldron, even in Celtic mythology, was often a symbol of rebirth connected to the afterlife. In this story, it's definitely connected to a rebirth. So we could talk about him being put in a way, killed. Obviously, he's chopped up into pieces as a type of death. Him being put into the cauldron as a catabasis, right, a descent into the underworld. Literally. And again, if you didn't catch when I talked about the whole voyage being a voyage by sea, again, that whole idea is reminiscent of Gilgamesh and the crossing of the waters of death. So here again is that motif in various forms. But the rebirth happens when she mixes in the magic herbs and spices, and out pops a fully formed, renewed, vigorous Jason, ready to do battle the next day. Okay, so she's a powerful sorceress, without a doubt. Now, keep that kind of stuff in mind because she is not done. Yeah, it could even be seen as a womb. Very good, right? The cauldron of birth, a womb from which you emerge, which he does. So let's get to the task. The task is actually a possible task. He is going to win, but at the same time, he is going to lose because he's going to be cheating. I mean, essentially, as far as Aeetes is concerned. So the next day, with the ointment, with the renewed vigor, he goes out, he yokes the bulls, he plows the field. She tells him exactly how to handle the warriors that spring up from the dragon's teeth by throwing a rock into their midst. And them being kind of young warriors, they're not too intelligent. They start to turn on each other and basically kill each other off so that Jason only has the last one or two to deal with himself. And Aeetes immediately realizes that Jason has had help in the task, and he's disqualified. All right? So he knows immediately who it was that helped Jason. So he is not only aware that Jason is cheating, but he's aware that he has been betrayed by his daughter. And this is a bitter revelation for Aeetes. The fleece is off the table. Jason has no choice but to attempt to steal the thing on his own at this point. Medea definitely needs to get out of town before her father punishes her. And the two of them team up to go to the garden, steal the fleece before they flee from Iolcus. Now, the garden, remember, is guarded by a great dragon. Jason relies again on Medea here to put the dragon to sleep, which she does. Jason is then able to go up to the tree, remove the fleece, and what he does with it is also really telling. He takes the ram's fleece, and he puts the ram's head over his own like a helmet, draping the fleece across his shoulders, reminiscent of who? You've seen the image before, but there's a huge difference, right? He is treating it as a trophy in the pattern of Heracles, right? The Nemean lion, which Heracles wore after his first labor, was a trophy that he earned. This was a trophy that showed his greatness, his strength, his power. And when Jason does the exact same thing, he too is claiming greatness and power, yet he didn't do anything to actually earn that trophy. Medea did the task for him. Medea was the key to his success. And even along the way, it's his crew that ultimately are the keys to most of the successes along the mission. So when Jason puts this thing on, we get a glimpse of his character in the process of transforming. You see a little bit of hubris. You see his arrogance beginning to manifest. This is different than we saw in the beginning when he carried the old woman across the river, right? Very gentlemanly, very honorable. Now, things are going to his head. This is a bad twist in the tale of Jason. Now, it gets worse after this. Immediately, once they have the fleece, they need to get out of Iolcus, which they do. They steal the fleece, and here's another red figure vase painting showing the dragon being put to sleep by Medea and Jason behind taking the fleece off the tree. And then a nice statue displaying Jason prominently holding on to the ram skin. Okay, so that's what we just talked about. Now, the departure. This is the flight, which we can call the flight into madness because literally it's going to be like these two are going insane. As they flee Iolcus, Medea and Jason decide to take with them Medea's younger brother Absyrtus. Now, Absyrtus, in some accounts, is a teen. In the more traumatic accounts, he is just an infant child. But they take a hold of him as a hostage to give them some protection from the anger of Aeetes, who wants Medea brought back and wants to punish Jason. But if they have possession of the child, he's probably going to be a little bit hesitant to do anything too rash. So the Argo sails away under the power of the crew, sailing as fast as they can. King Aeetes sends out his fleet to pursue them. And his ships are more plentiful and smaller and faster than the Argo, and they're gaining on the Argo. To slow the ships down, Medea and Jason proceed to take baby Absyrtus on the deck of the ship and chop him into little pieces in front of the eyes of the watching Argonauts, all of which are in utter state of horror as they continue to throw piece by piece of the little boy overboard in order to slow the ships down, because it would be appropriate to gather together the pieces of the young prince for proper burial. You don't want to not bury the child appropriately. There'll be no hope of an afterlife from the Greek conception. So the ships basically stop, collect the pieces, which buys the Argo time to get away, which they do. And they immediately flee to the island of Medea's aunt, a very famous witch by the name of Circe. Now, Circe is probably one of the most famous witches in all of Greek mythology, and if you ever read the Odyssey, I know we're not going to be covering it in this semester, Circe is one of the stops along the voyage of Odysseus. Odysseus actually lives for quite a while with Circe as lovers. Anyways, the Argonauts think they have gone literally insane. In some accounts, they not only chop up the baby, but they're actually drinking of his blood as they do this. This is gruesome. This is barbaric. This is not the signs of a civilized figure, but literally a wild and maniacal figure. So if he was at hubris a second ago, he's going a little bit beyond hubris at this point into utter madness. Now, the voyage home includes a number of other adventures. Somehow they ultimately bypass Greece altogether, but along the way there are a few places they stop. One thing worth noting is the encounter with the sirens. If you're familiar with the sirens, they're kind of like these mermaid-esque type figures, different ways they're depicted in Greek mythology, sometimes again as bird-like figures, much like the Harpies. But the sirens are famous for their wonderful singing. This painting here is actually a picture of Odysseus, who encountered the sirens in his voyage. And he wanted to hear the beauty of their song, because the idea with the sirens is they would lure sailors to their death. This is probably a type of legend that arose based on ancient seafaring, the fact that ships would often be smashed upon the rocks, very difficult to navigate, and they would often attribute these shipwrecks to the lure of the sirens. But in the story of Odysseus, he wants to hear the song of the sirens and plugs the ears of his crew so that they will not be distracted. He himself is tied to the mast so that he could hear without being lured overboard. With Jason, the Argonauts actually have a built-in siren-proof hero in the figure of Orpheus. Orpheus, who is the wonderful musician figure, is actually able to play his lyre. And his music is even more enthralling than theirs. So the Argonauts are able to listen to him and drown out the lure of the sirens, which is kind of neat. Okay, so Orpheus, the musician hero. Another stop along the way is to the island of Crete, where they encounter the giant bronze warrior known as Telos, who they end up defeating by removing a nail peg from the giant's heel, which allows all of the blood ichor to flow out of him, and he basically dies. The giant Telos is actually included in some of the neat motion picture versions of the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Most likely is derived from the ancient Greek technique of bronze casting. It's called the lost wax technique when you're casting bronze, which would involve the melting of a wax that the mold that was used for the bronze. It's a little bit complicated, but if you're interested in the lost wax technique, you could find some interesting information on the internet about that, but Telos probably arises from that. Along the way, he's also offered hospitality by the famous Phaeacian king Alcinous, another figure who shows up in the story of Odysseus. He's a host for Odysseus years later, but Alcinous gives them shelter, and at the time when they're visiting Alcinous, supposedly the fleet of Aeetes tracks them down and wants the return of Medea to her father. And Alcinous, being wise, realizes that it's appropriate to return her to the father with one exception, and that would be if Medea is married to Jason, in which case he will not return her to her father. So the king's wife very smartly warns Jason and Medea of this fact that in the morning, if she is a single woman, she will be returned to her father. So that night they secretly wed. Okay, so finally Jason, in kind of a rushed situation, is forced to fulfill his promise to marry Medea and protect Medea. Anyways, they eventually reach back to their homeland of Iolcus, the return, after a huge voyage around the Mediterranean, and present the fleece to Pelias. Now, in the meantime, the problem is Aeetes has passed away. Not Aeetes, I'm sorry. Aeson, Jason's dad, has passed away. And Pelias decides he's not going to give the throne back because the deal was, if the fleece is returned to him, he'll return the throne to Aeson. Aeson's no longer alive, so no longer is there a deal to accompany it. Jason, of course, has no idea what to do about this, but Medea does. Medea is going to exact revenge on Pelias, since he fails to deliver the throne. Now, remember, Medea is not somebody you want to mess with. Medea disguises herself, again, there are various accounts of this, Medea disguises herself as an old woman, the perfect disguise, goes in to meet with the king in his throne room, and the king, Pelias, he's kind of an old man himself at this point, and he tells Pelias, I've got the power to turn you young again, right? The lure of eternal youth, something everybody from Gilgamesh on has been after. Pelias says, I'd like some proof that you have the ability to do this. So she turns herself right in front of his eyes into the form of a young woman. And he says, that's very impressive, but how do I know that you weren't young all along? Maybe the old image was just a disguise. You need to show me by turning something that I know is old young again. So he has brought in this old goat that he owned and has been in the household for years. He knows it's an old animal. He says, if you could turn this goat into a young kid again, then I'll believe you've got the power to turn me young as well. So she takes the goat and she chops it up into pieces, puts it into a magic cauldron, which she mixes in the magical herbs and spices, much like the ritual she did with Jason. Out pops a renewed, fully formed young kid. And Pelias, get all the names confused here, Pelias says, I would like you to do this for me. So Medea puts Pelias to sleep, calls in Pelias' daughters, and has them, I don't know how she convinced them to do this, but she convinces them to chop their father up into pieces and put his body into the cauldron. And you can already see what is about to happen. While they're stirring the cauldron, Medea slips out of the room without ever mixing in the magic herbs and spices, and that is the end of the evil King Pelias. But unfortunately, it is not the return of the throne to Jason. Jason and Medea, of course, now need to go into exile, and away they go. The throne is never, ever obtained by Jason. Now, that's kind of where the story of Jason and his adventures with the fleece end. We don't have a straightforward happy ending. He may have accomplished the task, but he has not accomplished his ultimate goal of a throne. And this is essentially where the story of the Medea by Euripides is going to pick up. So I want to actually talk about that wonderful tragedy. In exile, Jason ends up in Corinth. Now, years and years have passed. He's been married to Medea. He has had children with Medea, and he set up a home in Corinth. Now, at the time, there is one final opportunity that seems to present itself whereby Jason can become king. Not king of Iolcus, but king of Corinth. The king, Creon, has a daughter by the name of Glauce. She's young, she's beautiful, and she needs to be married. And Jason figures, if I marry Glauce, I will become king of Corinth. All I need to do is get rid of Medea. So, in the play, The Medea, one of the central dramatic moments is when Jason goes to Medea to divorce her, and they have a long discussion about the custody of the children, basically. It's a custody dispute. And it works out something like this. I'm going to abbreviate it and simplify it. It's absolutely wonderful dialogue in the play, but Medea begs for a sense of mercy. She says, you're going to abandon me after everything that I have done for you, right? From abandoning my father, abandoning Iolcus, helping you obtain the fleece and your revenge on Pelias, being a faithful wife to you all these years, providing you with children. The least you could do if you're going to divorce me is let me have the kids, right? Let me have one piece of security, right? She's, again, a woman who would be unprotected. This is an incredibly bad thing for Jason to do to her. She's a foreign woman without protection in the Greek world, okay, if he does this to her. Now, Jason turns around and says, yes, you've done all these wonderful things for me, but I've done more for you than you've done for me. So let's just look at it. I've taken you away from your barbarian homeland and brought you to a civilization like Greece. What more can any man give a woman? And he takes the kids, leaving her with nobody. Now, this doesn't just show you what a scumbag Jason is. It actually shows you what an idiot Jason is, because he knows who he's married to, and he knows how powerful Medea is, and he should know exactly what she can do to him in her anger. Okay, so Medea, a woman scorned, is going to get the ultimate revenge. She prepares a wedding gift for the Princess Glauce, which is a wonderful gown, which she happens to dose with wonderful magical chemicals. Should already cause you to have a flashback to the story of Heracles. So this gift is presented to the princess. And on her wedding day, before the wedding, she takes the gown out and she puts it on. And immediately, her skin starts to be eaten away by the chemicals, and it's sticking to her, and she's in agony, screaming for help, and her father, Creon, comes to her aid and tries to remove the dress from his daughter, and he too is stuck to the gown, and the both of them together go up in flames, and Jason, who's standing there watching helpless, sees his entire future go up into flames, because without having married the princess, he is not going to be heir to the kingdom. And to make matters as bad as they possibly can be, not only is he robbed of the throne, Medea makes sure he is also robbed of his children. She figures if she can't have the kids, then neither can Jason, and she murders all of her children before she flies off at the end of the play in a chariot drawn by flying serpents. Now, of course, Jason, it's a tragedy at that level. Medea, of course, goes off flying into the sunset, where she's going to cause other problems in other stories, particularly in the city of Athens. This ties into the whole story of the great hero Theseus. She ends up marrying King Aegeus of Athens, but I'm not going to go into any more stories about her. But for Jason, not only is it a tragedy, at this point, there is a final tragedy. You find out that Jason never, ever obtains a throne or any of the glory that he was after. And in the very end of his story, it is that he is one day just relaxing, laying down, taking a nap in the shadow of the Argo, his boat, which has been pulled up on the shore. And under the prow of the ship, he's sleeping in the shade. And the ship, which has gotten rather old along with Jason, cracks The prow breaks, falls on top of the sleeping hero, and crushes him to death. Poetic justice, right? Now, we've kind of wrapped up the story of Jason. You could think about whether or not now he is going to qualify. I want to reevaluate the story briefly as far as a hero's narrative, but also Jason, like I said, as a hero. Those are the two things I want to discuss. First, let's talk about the hero's journey, kind of walking through Campbell's monomyth, right? The idea of the three-part departure, initiation, and return motif, separation, initiation, and return. The story of Jason has a lot of the elements here. Okay, you've got the call to adventure. You've got the refusal of the call, not so much. Okay, we can kind of point out where he has these and where he doesn't. Supernatural aid, he definitely has that along the way, both with respect to Hera and definitely Aphrodite. Crosses the threshold, obviously, as he leaves on his journey. There are numerous thresholds that he crosses, but that first threshold, of course, as he begins his sea voyage, which involves going into a ship, crossing the body of water that is symbolic of a trip to the underworld. Essentially, he's in the belly of the whale, in the belly of the beast throughout most of his journey. And the idea that he's, riding in a big seagoing vessel is part of that imagery. Now, that whole thing, of course, is the initiation, the road of trials. We already said he's got numerous. Meeting with a goddess, of course, Medea, Aphrodite, each of which will count. Medea, of course, is the temptress, the love interest, but also the assistant or the ally that is going to be the key to his victory. As far as an atonement with the Father, the whole mission is in a way to redeem the Father's throne for him. Apotheosis, we'll hold off. We can question that one. The ultimate boon, he does attain the quest of the fleece and returns the fleece home. So he does have a return voyage. Doesn't really refuse the return, although it is delayed. It takes him a while to get back home. Along the way, you've got various elements of magic that assist him. The island of Circe, etc. He's rescued, again, by Medea in a number of places, then eventually crosses the return threshold back to Iolcus. Does he attain the position of master of two worlds? Not really. Okay, he may have the fleece, but he never attains the prominence or the throne that he's after. And as far as his freedom to live, we already said that it ends in kind of a tragedy for him. So while it follows the general pattern, there are some exceptions maybe to working out the story the exact way that Campbell thinks these stories ought to be worked out. But if we look at some of the common elements, which I've given you before, I think a lot of these are nailed by the story of Jason. There's a unique birth, without a doubt, right? He's a child whose father has just been overthrown and he's cast off into exile, stage 2. There's the mystery of identity. He doesn't really know who he is until he's matured and trained by Chiron, who is going to be his mentor figure, who reveals to him, of course, the destiny of going back and getting control of the kingdom of Iolcus, which is his birthright. You've got an adversary in Pelias. You've got an adversary in Aeetes later on. There's the call to adventure issued by Pelias, setting him out on the quest, which is for the Grail, but the quest for the fleece. A number of impossible tasks, 2 of which I pointed out. A challenge presented by the opposite sex, who is also an ally and gives supernatural aid. Various catabases, the whole idea of his dying and being reborn from the cauldron, his journey by sea, all of that. A redemption, possibly, in how he comes back and tries to redeem his father's throne. Clearly a homecoming. Clearly a tragic end. And then the one big question that we have is there an apotheosis? Should have actually brought up this next scene as I walked through that. I gave you some visuals from different modern pop culture stories. But we can see a lot of these same things with the Jason story. So the unique birth, the exile. Here's a wonderful red figure vase painting where you've got this, looks like a little action figure more than a child, in the hands of the great centaur Chiron. This is baby Jason, or possibly baby Achilles. Remember, Achilles was also raised by Chiron for the most part, so sometimes I could work in a different picture. The ruby ring, right, revealing his identity. The prophetic destiny, here's Jason coming to Iolcus. We already saw this picture with Chiron as his mentor. The adversaries, the call to adventure, the quest for the fleece. A clip from, a visual from the famous, I forget the year, it was a 1960s version called Jason in the Argonauts, where he fights, these are supposed to be the Spartoi, which are depicted in that movie as skeleton warriors. kind of that stop action animation of the age. This was like peak high tech, what is it called? Special effects from those movies back in the day. I used to love watching those movies when I was a kid, Saturday afternoon. Medea figure, the supernatural aid that she gives him, the catabasis, the redemption, the homecoming, the tragic end, and a wonderful picture here from, again, red figure Greek vase painting showing Medea murdering her children. I think I gave you a glimpse of that on a previous slide. And then the question of the apotheosis. There doesn't actually seem to be an apotheosis, which leads us to the actual last question. Is Jason a hero? Has Jason accomplished the tasks and manifested the characteristics that we said a good hero needs to manifest? So you could think about that for a second. Is he a role model? He clearly starts out the story as an admirable figure, carrying Hera across the way, trying to redeem the throne for his father, kind of this devotion to his parentage. But as the course of the story progresses, we do see an evolution in character, but in very much the opposite direction of the evolution that we saw with Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh goes from being a self-centered, arrogant king and abusive to being a king who actually cares about his people and redeems himself by the end of the story, attaining a sort of fame and immortality. Jason moves in the opposite direction. From that noble youth, we see hubris take hold. By the end of the story, he's doing the most horrific actions, betraying the one figure that was his best companion and key to all of his success, and ultimately is ruined at the end of the story because of his bad decisions. So as far as a role model, we could question. I would say no. He's not going to qualify on that grounds, and on that ground alone, if you have the three characteristics that you need to have to be a hero, then he is disqualified because he doesn't have at least one of them. The other two characteristics, of course, were courage. He seems to be courageous, though he's not the most courageous of his crew. As a matter of fact, I already said the success along the voyage was mainly due to the men he had with him. He was good at picking a crew, but as a hero, he's a little lackluster. The third criteria was, is he a savior? Is he a man who provides a way of life or provides life to other people? And unlike Heracles, who is the greatest example of Greek heroism, he doesn't really make the world a better place, a safer place, or does very much at all in his adventure to save others. So if it comes down to an analysis, the ancient Greeks may classify Jason as a hero in the very generic and broad sense, but for our purposes, I don't think Jason is actually going to qualify as a true hero. The other thing that just jumped to mind, you probably want to think of the story also as another element of that wild versus civilized. I already referred to Jason as kind of going and descending into madness and insanity and being a very uncivilized figure in his quest for a throne. So it's, again, this interesting balance. But the story of Jason, if nothing, is a very entertaining story. If you haven't read some of the original myths, I always recommend that you do this. And I think you really do need to enjoy Euripides' play, the Medea, to get that last dramatic conclusion to the tale. That's actually brilliant. This is probably, like I said, the Argonautica by Apollonius is a summary of the adventures. It's not the greatest epic, but Euripides' play is one of the greatest tragedies and a wonderful work of literature, so I would recommend it.